Yo, what is up everybody? As usual, this is your boy Lahima here. Today we're going to be talking about how to make good melodies in a surefire way that works every time. I'm pretty sure you've all seen probably like 1,000 tutorials on just how to make good melodies, but none of them really target the main issue as to what actually makes a good melody. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So before we go ahead and get started, if you don't have a very strong understanding of things like chords and scales, I would heavily suggest you watch one of my prior videos, which I'll link in the card section, either here or whatever it ends up at. And that video just goes over all the basics of music theory. It covers everything from notes all the way up to chords and scales and even more than that. So go ahead and watch that and then come back to this video because you're definitely going to need it. And with that being said, let's go ahead and hop in. The first thing to talk about when discussing kind of what makes a good melody is to discuss something called harmony. Harmony comes in basically two types of varieties, which is pleasing and dissonant. Dissonant, as you would expect, makes the harmony sound tense, while pleasing gives a resolution-like feeling. And both have their own place in harmony. But before we get too deep into harmony, let's actually talk about the main function or the common way we see harmony, which is something called chords. Chords generally are played in something called a chord progression. Chord progressions essentially consist of three types of chords. Those three types are tonic, predominant, and dominant. And each have a critical function in how a chord progression feels. And these tonic chords come in two different types as well, which is the major scale version and the minor scale version. In the major scale, the tonic chords are 1, 3, 6, and in the minor scale, they are also 1, 3, 6. The next chord function is predominant. Predominant basically represents the feeling of journey away from the home base or from the tonic chord. And in the major scale, the predominant chords are 2, 4, and 6. Although 6 is a strange one, it doesn't have a particularly strong effect as a predominant chord. In the minor scale, the predominant chords are 2, 4, and 6, but if we use their major parallels, it would be as if you're playing the 7, 2, and 4 respectively. And lastly, we have the dominant chord. The dominant chord is a climax in the chord progression. It is essentially the most intense part of the chord progression. It is what we lead up to from the predominant chord that resolves then back to the tonic. In the major scale, the dominant chords is a 5, 7, and 3. But a quick note about the 3 chord, you'll generally see that it is weak at any sort of function. And in the minor scale, the dominant chords are essentially 5 and 3. There is one more, but it's very rarely used because it's a very weak resolution power. I know that was a lot of information, so let's go hop into Ableton and look at some simple chord progressions just to understand chord functionality. So I have in front of me is a simple chord progression in C major, and it goes 1, 4, 5, and 1 again. This is a perfect example of the tonic, predominant, and then dominant chord progression that I was mentioning earlier, where we build up some tension from the predominant chord, then we maximize that tension with the dominant chord, and then we rest with the tonic chord. So let's give it a quick listen and just see how it sounds. So in the chord progression, we can definitely hear that the second and third chord are building up tension that is released by the C major chord or the 1 chord of that scale. And this is what I mean by predominant and dominant chords. Predominant chords are a sense of journey chord. They build up very little tension, but they do build up tension. The dominant chord maximizes tension. It is meant to make a lot of tension so that it can be released by 1 chord. So why is it important to actually understand how chord functionality works when we're talking about melody? Well, it's because that chords heavily relate to melody, and how they relate is due to something called chord tones and non-chord tones. Chord tones are essentially any tone that resides in a chord. For example, if I were to play a C major chord and play a G over that C major chord, that is a chord tone. A non-chord tone is any tone that does not reside in the chord. For example, if I play a D over a C major chord, that D that I play over will be considered a non-chord tone. And due to harmony, all chord tones will always sound good over any chord because they already reside in the chord. They will act as resolution. Non-chord tones, on the opposite, will act as tension, and we can use this to our advantage to make good melodies. So let's go back and look at our previous example and add a little melody on top with only chord tones. So here we have the same chord progression we had before, and I'm going to make an arbitrary melody and not even play it ahead of time. And once I play it, you'll see that it actually sounds harmonically pleasing because I'm only going to be playing chord tones. So for the first chord, I'm going to play C and E, which reside in the C major chord, In the second chord, I'm going to play F and A, which resides in the F major chord. For the third chord, I'm going to play G and B, which resides in the G major chord. And lastly, we'll play C, which resides in the C major chord. So as we can see, the melody sounds good. It's harmonically pleasing, which is a good thing. That's what we want from our melody. So the first big tip I have for making melodies is to only play tones that reside in chords. If you have a melody that you're playing that does not have a chord underneath it, act as if it does. So for instance, if I were to mute the chords underneath and still play the same melody, it would still sound harmonically pleasing. The reason why it sounds harmonically pleasing is because the melody is mimicking the chords underneath, even though there are none. For instance, the first two notes are mimicking a C major chord. The second two notes, note 3 and 4, are mimicking a F major chord, then the G major chord, and the C major chord respectively. So we can use our melody to mimic chords when there aren't actual chords there. Which leads to one issue, which is, what if you actually want to include non-chord tones in your melody? Well, we should know a couple things before we do that. Thing number one, adding non-chord tones in will inherently make the melody much more intense. This is not a bad thing, it is done to taste. Thing number two, non-chord tones should always resolve back to a chord tone. Not doing so, for instance, infinitely stacking on more and more non-chord tones in a melody will make your melody eventually sound untasteful and displeasing because they never actually resolve to a chord tone. Thing number three, you should use non-chord tones, I would say very sparingly. You want to keep them to somewhat a minimum. It obviously depends on what you're going for, because you always want to make sure there's a sense of resolution in your melody. So let's go back to our previous example and look at including some non-chord tones to spice up the melody. Keep in mind, I'm going to throw the chords back on just to make it a little bit more easier to hear the harmony. So what I've done is just added two non-chord tones to the melody, and these two are this D note that resides over the C major chord and the F major chord. These do not reside in either of these chords, but they will work solely because these two notes resolve immediately back to chord tones. In the case of the C major chord, it goes C, D, G, and as we know, D is not in the C major chord, but since it immediately resolves back to the G note, which is a chord tone, the harmony will work and function fine. And the same thing applies for the F major chord. We go D, and then we go A. Although D does not reside in the F major chord, it immediately resolves back to the A, so it works fine. So let's listen to the melody and make sure it actually works. And as you can see, the harmony works fine. By following the rule of always resolving back to a chord tone, you will essentially make any melody you make sound good immediately. And this is the main trick to having good melodies, is making sure that even when you're using non-chord tones, that you always resolve back to a chord tone. And also making sure we're not using a large amount of consecutive non-chord tones. So let's hop back into that example and show that real quick. What it would sound like if you had consecutive non-chord tones that never resolve back to a chord tone. So over the C major chord, what I've done is I removed all the chord tones, and now what we have playing on top of the chord is this F, D, and D, which once again are not chord tones. They do not reside in the chord. So this melody will sound unpleasing, at least over the C major chord. And then over the F major chord, what I've done is we have the opposite. What I've done is I've played D, D, and then A, which resides in the F major chord. So this harmony will work, although it will sound a little bit more tense because we have two consecutive Ds playing after each other. So listen to the melody again and confirm what we're saying. And as we thought, the melody that played over the C major chord was not very pleasing. I would even say it was very uncomfortable to listen to. But the melody that played over the F major chord, although it started off being almost unpleasing, it eventually resolved to a chord tone and became pleasing. And this is the main important thing. By understanding chord functionality as well as melody and harmony, we can build good sounding chord progressions and melody. So that pretty much is it for today, guys. just a couple quick things I wanted to mention. As you probably noticed, I didn't mention a couple core concepts of what makes a melody good, for instance such as rhythm. If you guys want to see a video on that, please let me know in the comment section down below, and I'll definitely make one. But with that being said, as usual, if you like the video and you like me, go ahead and make sure to give the video a like, and go ahead and make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell button so you stay notified when I post new stuff. Also, while you're at it, go ahead and make sure to follow my Instagram at LaHimiBeats. I'll post cool content all the time like gear reviews and stuff I'm working on. And lastly, most importantly, I appreciate you guys watching the video, and I will see you guys next time. Lahima, out.